to me, that's part of understanding the erotic and claiming it as sacred, is also understanding it's a mystery. And it's a mystery that often reveals itself very differently to people. Right? And that's okay. Like, I don't have to define the mystery for somebody else.
I think I want a t-shirt that says that.
Right, yeah.
Welcome to Bespoken Bones with your host, Pavini Moray, connecting ancestors, sex, magic, and science. Pavini explores transpersonal tools for erotic wellness every new and full moon, engaging educators, healers, spiritual leaders, and scientists in revolutionary dialogue. Get ready to feel good and go deep. This is Bespoken Bones.
Hi, welcome to Bespoken Bones, Ancestors at the Crossroads of Sex, Magic, and Science. We're in the business of healing trauma, connecting with our roots, and developing radiant erotic wellness in past, present, and future generations. And I'm your host, Pavini Moray, and I'm going to introduce you to someone who really needs no introduction, but it's a delight and an honor anyway. So I'm here today with Starhawk, and Starhawk is an author, an activist, permaculture designer, and teacher, a prominent voice in the modern earth-based spirituality and ecofeminism movements. And she's the author or co-author of 13 books, including The Spiral Dance, A Rebirth of the Ancient Religion of the Great Goddess, and the ecotopian novel, The Fifth Sacred Thing, and its sequel, The City of Refuge. And her most recent nonfiction book is The Empowerment Manual, a guide for collaborative groups on group dynamics, power, conflict, and communications. Starhawk founded the Earth Activist Training, teaching permaculture design grounded in spirituality and with a focus on activism. And she travels internationally, lecturing and teaching on earth-based spirituality, the tools of ritual, and the skills of activism. And for more information, you can check out her website, which is starhawk.org. So Starhawk, welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on with you.
Yeah, I'd like to just start by inviting you to invite in any ancestors of lineage, of the craft, of activism, anyone you would like to call to be with us in this conversation today.
All right. Well, I would maybe just ask listeners to take a moment and get comfortable and take a breath. And to acknowledge that right now, the land that I'm, well, not standing, but sitting on, is the land ancestrally of the Ohlone people. And to acknowledge the ancestors of the land that you are on, whether you know their names or don't, and all the lineages, generations and generations of ancestors who have guarded and cared for and protected and tended the land. I'd like to honor our lineages that come down through our bloodlines, and take a moment, if you know what those are, just take a moment and acknowledge what they are, and honor how they have built the body that you walk around in, and say thank you and give gratitude. And I would like to honor our spiritual ancestors, the ancestors that we resonate with in terms of the traditions, in terms of the wisdom, in terms of the knowledge and heritage that they have passed on, the ancestors who have left us teachings, have left us poetry, have left us liturgy, dance, music, ritual, ceremony. Take a moment and honor those ancestors. Give them gratitude. And let's honor the ancestors of culture. Those who give us the languages that we speak and the heritages that come with that. All the mixture, all of the acknowledging all the wonderful things and all the terrible things in those histories. All the gifts and also all the struggles. All the brilliance and all the mistakes. All the compassion and all the cruelty. And just take a moment and acknowledge that that is our lineage. And say thank you for the good things. And let's take a breath and honor the ancestors of activism. In every lineage, go back, there are those who have stood out against the cruelty, who have struggled for justice, who've struggled for freedom, who have struggled to protect the community. The long line of those who defended against invasions and colonizations, and the long lines of those who rebelled against autocracy, and the long lines of those who rebelled against enforced gender conformity, enforced divisions of race and class and culture and religion. The long lines of those who were able to look beyond difference and recognize each other with compassion. Let us honor them and give gratitude to them. And know that the best way that we honor them is to continue the work. And in that, we can ask for their help. Thank you, and blessed be.
Blessed be. Thank you for that. When you honor the ancestors of activism, those who have resisted, I often hear folks who are resisting now, who are either on the front lines or in their own way, working towards a more just world. I hear the exhaustion that we all face. Yeah. And I know that you've been, doing this work for decades. And I just wonder about you, obviously the ancestors are a resource to call on, but how do you stay nourished in this? And how do you not burn out and give up?
For me, really there's two things. One is having a strong connection to nature and taking time to renew that connection, to spend some time each day just in the natural world, whether that's my back garden or whether that's out in some beautiful wild place, observing, connecting, opening up and letting that world speak to me. I find that tremendously nourishing. And the other is community. Having a community of activists, and particularly one that also is rooted in some kind of spiritual practice or ritual practice of connection, is, again, one of the most important ways that we can renew ourselves. And I think often in activist circles, we tend to get focused on the work or the outcome, and we don't value our relationships enough and nurture our relationships in our community enough. And that to me is a mistake, because if we want our activism to be sustained, it's sustained by this sense of belonging to a community of fellow activists who are in their own ways struggling together for justice.
What would you say about this thing that happens sometimes in oppressed, I would say always happens in oppressed communities, where we're working, we're fighting together, and maybe we're praying together, and yet we're also re-traumatizing each other. We're also perpetuating the same kinds of trauma that we've experienced on each other, kind of lateral oppression, and anything you want to say to that?
Well, human beings are difficult, right? It's the unfortunate truth that when we make political and social movements, we have to do it with other people, because really, we can pick a great movement with dogs. Dogs are friendly, loyal. They do fight, but you can kind of tell, who's going to fight. Right? But with people, we're complicated, and we do have a tendency, especially if we're carrying our wounds, to lash out with them and, as you said, inflict them on others. So I think part of our work as activists has to be the work of acknowledging trauma and working to heal that trauma, and that reclaiming, which is the spiritual pagan tradition that I'm part of, that you're part of. For a long time, we recognized, I think, early on in the 80s that we used to say we have a many-legged cauldron. One of the legs is the deep magic, and one of the legs has to be the personal healing and the trauma healing. And one of the legs then is the activism in the world. And I'd add another leg for me is the actual earth healing and the practical ways of regenerating the actual land. But without doing that personal work of healing, we do tend to then go enact it. And unfortunately, I think today's climate of social media and the fact that we have a racist, sexist, immoral thug bully, in the White House as a constant model of bad behavior, tends to create an atmosphere where people think that the way to do politics is to bash everybody who doesn't agree with you. And again, I think that ends up being very destructive to communities. I think also one of the things that trauma does to us is when we're traumatized, it's kind of like, it's like if you have an inflammation in your body. I have like bad knees at the moment, and every little thing, if I try to stand up, out of a chair, it's like a jolt of pain. And it's kind of the same with emotional trauma, something that ordinarily you could just shrug off, right? If you've got like that wounding there, that inflammation, it's going to cause you a jolt of pain. And sometimes it's hard to differentiate. Am I actually doing something, is this something that's actually damaging, or is this something that's just triggering that old inflammation? And so I think we have to look at that and maybe kind of give each other a little, cut each other a little slack sometimes to be able to say, okay, I hear this and I see where it's coming from. There's got to be trauma and wounding. At the same time, I think sometimes when that's directed at you, you're not doing the person a service by, sometimes I think by kind of acquiescing in somebody's self-definition as a victim and seeing them as, oh, this poor person, they're so victimized, they're so wounded, they can't be held responsible for what they do. I think we support each other's healing by seeing each other's strengths and acknowledging each other's strengths and calling each other to our strengths.
Mm-hmm. There's something about like modeling resiliency, right?
Yeah. And that's not always easy to do. And it's also not always easy to find those fine lines. Like sometimes we make a lot of mistakes in the process. But to me, that's kind of what I struggled to do as an activist and also as a healer. I actually was trained as a therapist, so it's not my primary work anymore. But part of that work is, again, to recognize that we help people grow into themselves sometimes by seeing their strengths, even when they don't, and holding them to those strengths.
I want to talk a little bit about the healing power of ritual. But before we do that, would you be willing to just give the briefest of overviews? I'm imagining that most folks listening have some sense of what reclaiming is, but to just contextualize the conversation we're about to have a little bit.
Yeah. Reclaiming is, what is reclaiming? I'd say reclaiming is a perfect example of what we might call an emergent system. It started as a few of us, like in our living room, who did rituals together and had a women's circle in the late 70s and the 80s, and decided to teach a couple of classes we felt that we'd gone through so many struggles ourselves around power that we wanted to model shared power. So we always co-taught, and we started teaching a class on the elements of magic, where each week we go through a different element, and then the next week the class would invoke that element from the week before, until by the end, the class themselves created their own ritual. We had turned over power to them. And that first class was so successful, they wanted a second one. We came up with a pentacle of power. An iron pentacle class to teach. They really liked that. They wanted a third. We taught a rites of passage. By that time, we recruited some of our students into co-teaching, and pretty soon we had a whole collective. We also created a big ritual for Halloween. The first one in 1979 was partly the pretext was my book, The Spiral Dance, had just come out. And we wanted to do a book party, and the publishers put up some money so we could rent a big space and throw a big ritual. And that was the first spiral dance ritual. And we wanted it to embody both our magic, but also some of our political sensibilities. So we had litanies for things like the animals that had gone extinct and the different people that were facing oppression and the different political struggles of the time. So Reclaiming kind of began again as this little tiny group doing ritual and teaching classes. And then as it grew and expanded, we decided to start teaching witch camps, have week-long intensives. I think the first one was like in 87 or 88. And those started to expand. And by the mid-90s, we had witch camps that had spawned communities in lots of different parts of the country and in Canada. Our little collective in San Francisco was sort of running everything, kind of, but not really, because it wasn't really possible to do that. It was completely sort of organic and messy structure. And we went through a big process of kind of restructuring it and realizing we were no longer a collective. We actually were more of a network. And we modeled it on structures we'd learned from doing direct action at Diablo Canyon and in the anti-intervention movement in the 80s, where we had spokes councils where different groups sent representatives to a spokes council that met and made decisions. But big decisions would go back to the individual groups. It wasn't like it was exactly a representative body. It was more literally a place where people would come to speak and coordinate. So now we're kind of an extended network with groups all over North America, in Europe, in Australia. I think there's even some people in Brazil and South America that identify as reclaiming. And as part of that restructuring in the 90s, we also created a document that was our principles of unity. Because we decided if we formulated our principles, we felt like we all kind of intuitively knew what they were, but if we actually went through the work of writing them down, then other people would be able to look at them and say, yes, I agree, or I don't agree. And the thing could expand without being linked to particular personalities. So that's kind of reclaiming. This year, we're going to celebrate our 40th anniversary spiral dance ritual here in the San Francisco Bay Area on October 26th. And I'm very excited for that. It's kind of hard for me to believe it's 40 years, but
yeah, it was, I was doing the spiral dance for a number of years before it suddenly hit me what we were doing in that ritual, which is, my sense of it is it's death practice. It's how to train to make the crossing when you die so that you do land on the other shore, you do become an ancestor, and that you can continue to support the good work of healing. And I just wonder if that's congruent with your understanding? And like, what do you say to that about like, how do we train to become ancestors, and how do we train for our deaths, and anything that there you'd like to share?
I think you're really right on about that aspect of the spiral dance. I would say it's both an honoring and a connection to the beloved dead and to those who have gone before, to the ancestors. And we often say, well, there's the ancestors, which are all of those lineages of bloodline, of culture, of spiritual heritage, of activist heritage. There's the mighty dead, who are sort of specific figures in the line of the craft who have contributed to the development of magic and who continue to hold a protective and a magical purpose even after death, and specific figures from our own community who we identify as holding those roles. And then there are the beloved dead, which are our own personal family, friends, loved ones who have passed on. And particularly in the spiral dance, we honor those who passed on in the previous year. So Samhain traditionally is this time when we say the veil is thin between the worlds, when the world of the living and the unseen world, the spirit world, are close together. And it's easier to kind of pass through that veil and make a connection with those who've gone before, to ask for their wisdom, to ask for their help and guidance, and to also give them gratitude and honor and remember them, because keeping that memory alive helps, again, to keep their spirit, their being, their presence alive. So that is definitely a key part of the ritual and the ceremonies. And then that other part, we always do a trance journey to the Isle of Apples. And to me, as you said, that is in part practice. It's like learning the way, so that when the time comes when you die, you know the way and you have been there before and it feels familiar, and you don't have to be afraid, because you know that death is the other side of life, and then it leads on to a new beginning, and that it is an incredible mystery. But it is a mystery, like all the greatest mysteries, is a mystery that is common to every single one of us. We each come to that time and we each approach that time. And when, I believe, at least when we approach that time with courage, when we can look back on a life well spent, then that way opens up. And the tradition in the craft is that we do live many lifetimes. Our spirit comes and goes in many ways, in many forms. And but it's similar to like Hinduism, but it's a little different in that the goal is not to get off the wheel of birth and death, but the goal is to live a good life so that after death you can meet those that you love and continue to love them and be reborn and reconnected with them through other lifetimes.
Would you speak a little bit about your plan for your transition? Like, I know it's a big question.
You're just reminding me that I really need to go and like update my will. Right? I was just reading some article about, I guess, Washington State is now made it legal for human bodies to be composted. And there's a
awesome
company that will do that. And they have some special vat or casket or big box where they can put you in with the bacteria and the worms or whatever and just take it back. And for me, that's what I'd like to happen to my body. Either that or just be simply buried in the earth somewhere. I'm lucky to have some land up in Northern California, and I would probably like to just simply be buried there and let the composting happen. So physically, kind of that's my plan. Spiritually, my hope is that when that time comes for me, I will have some time to prepare for it, to be able to complete whatever I need to complete, and to be able to do it in a way that feels peaceful and that I'll be ready to accept it and feel like, okay, the work is done that I came here to do in this incarnation, and now I'm ready on to the next adventure.
I feel like you write about that in one of your books that I read recently. I can't remember which one, but you write about a character who transitions, and she's been an activist her whole life, and then she transitions in that way.
Yeah, in City of Refuge, when Maya dies.
Yeah, in City of Refuge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it is for her kind of like setting sail. And I was there with my mother when she died, and she'd been sick with cancer for many years, and my brother and I were both with her at the end, and she was very uncomfortable. The morphine was helping keep her somewhat comfortable, but she was having trouble breathing and had a lot of fluid in her lungs. So I started leading her on a trance journey, kind of the water journey I've led many, many times, where you start in a cavern as a drop of water and then bubble up as a spring and become a flowing river. And, I gotten her into the cavern and dissolving into water and started to bring her upwards. And she stopped me. She said, "No, I'm going in another direction now." And I always think about that. She, she was well aware she was dying. In some level, she had accepted it. At one point, the doctor came in and wanted to do some blood tests and test her potassium or something. She's like, "No, I don't want any more needles. It hurts. Stop it." And the doctor said, "Well, I have to do this, or, potassium could be out of balance. You could have a heart attack." And she said, "A heart attack? That'd be the best thing that can happen to me. I'm dying." Right? And then she thought for a moment. She looked and she said, "How will I know when I'm dead?" And I said, "I'll tell you, Mom." And she accepted that, and I did. When she finally died, my brother and I held her hand. We could hear her last breath. Her breathing finally stopped, and I just said, like, "You're dead, Mom." Yeah. And I had this series of dreams after she died for several months, and the dream was always like I'd come upon her and she would be alive somewhere, and I'd be like, "Oh my God, we made this terrible mistake. We thought you were dead, and here you're alive, and we just like sold everything you owned and cleaned out your house." They were very like anxiety-ridden ones. And finally, I had one where she said, "No, I moved into a new apartment." And after that, they stopped. And I felt like she was telling me, "I'm in the right place now. I made that."
Like she had arrived into. Yeah. Yeah. That's beautiful. Mm-hmm. Thank you for the personal there. I appreciate it. I want to pivot back to the community piece for a minute, which is when I was doing my dissertation research and I was reading about how community ritual is used to address trauma. In particular, I was reading about Angola, with when child soldiers come back from 12-year-olds, 8-year-olds come back from being at war. Like, what happens? How do they integrate back into the community? And it's, here in the West, we would put somebody in therapy, right? And we would say, "Oh, they have PTSD. They have to go through therapy." And the healing technologies that are being used there are really different, which is community-based ritual, where things happen. Like, the community won't accept the person back until they've gone through a series of specific rituals, specific to the person and specific to the community, of like, these are the things that have to happen before we can welcome you back. And this is the way that we address the trauma that you experienced, right? Really just totally different technologies, for healing and integrating. And I just imagine, wanting to go back to talking about how ritual can be used to heal community, especially the communities of activism where there is this kind of lateral violence that happens through just projecting trauma. Like, what have you seen be really effective? Like, what are skills or strategies that communities who are facing these kinds of disruptions can use communally, ritually, that are effective to create that welcoming back or that healing?
I know we've done different rituals in our activist circles around trauma, especially after actions that have been very traumatic. And, oftentimes it's really just having the chance to tell your story and be witnessed, can be a very powerful act of healing. Although I will say, not necessarily for everybody. People often will make like blanket statements about, what you need to do with trauma. And that's not true for everyone. I did trauma support in Palestine for the team that was with Rachel Corey, who is an American activist with the International Solidarity Movement, the group I was with that supports the nonviolent resistance in Palestine. And she had been trying to stop a bulldozer from bulldozing a Palestinian home down in Gaza, and the bulldozer ran her over. And the team that was with her, supported her, got her to the hospital, but she died. And they were, it was a very traumatic experience for them. And they were very young. Most of them were so young, it was the first time they'd really experienced death. And Doctors Without Borders came down to debrief everybody and had everyone tell the whole story and go through it piece by piece. And a number of them for years afterwards would say for them, reliving it and retelling it was actually more traumatic than experiencing it. So it doesn't hold true for everybody, but I think for many people, often being able to speak it, being able to release the feelings about it and be witnessed and be held in a way that where people aren't trying to fix you and people can actually tolerate the intensity of the emotion without themselves getting activated and getting uncomfortable can be very powerful. And that can be as simple as having a bowl of salt water in the center of a circle and having people be able to take a piece of salt and drop it in and speak something that's happened, have the group respond with a blessing. Oftentimes I find music or chanting or singing can be helpful in holding the energy and holding that intensity without just being submerged by it. We used to do a lot of rituals around wailing and crying, but I think music is actually more powerful in holding it and transmuting it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate that you said the storytelling piece can be re-traumatizing, right? And as well as helpful to some people. And it reflects what I've read, that there's cultures where it's like, okay, you get to tell your story once, you get to tell your story twice, but if you tell your story a third time, people will turn their backs, right? Because it's like there has to be that witnessing and that acknowledgement, but there's also that boundary of like, okay, and when am I just replaying this again and again, right?
When does my identity become the victim of this trauma instead of the resilient person who has like a multifaceted capacity?
Mm-hmm. I've experienced I was part of the free camp community for a long time. And one of the things that started to happen in the healing rituals was the grief altar, right? And I think kind of what you're talking about of like having a communal place to process grief together. that was contained. It was like contained on this cloth, and there was a bowl of salt water. And then I think the person who was bringing it had learned it from, not Malidoma Somé, his wife, whose name I'm forgetting right now, but that technology that she had learned from the Dagara people. And just that, like, having a really strong container for it and a time container and a community container of, like, not just being alone in our grief, but having that be witnessed, but also having it be tended by facilitators of that who are like, okay, and now the ritual is over,
right? Yeah.
Right? Now this cloth is being buried into the earth, and this is being brought back to the earth, back to the ancestors as a blessing of energy for them to transmute. That, like, we're not just going to hang out here forever, right? There's a time for this, and there's a time for that. But just, that it's like grief has its place and it has its time, and joy also has its place and its time, right?
My mother actually was a psychotherapist who became an expert in loss and grief after my father died when I was only 5. And she used to talk about grief. It's like a cycle. It goes through different stages. And if you give yourself to it, if you allow it to move through that, then it does move. It transforms, transmutes, and eventually you come to a place of acceptance or restitution. But if you try to avoid it or suppress it, then you often get stuck in some piece of it. And, and then it becomes more destructive.
So learning to be fluent with it, with the capacity to move with it, to feel with it, and to also let it go, to let it move through you. Yeah. Yeah. Good.
And a lot of cultures traditionally, in Jewish culture, the tradition around death is you have a full week of mourning. And today, most people, your loved one dies and you're lucky if you get a day off work the next day. People are expected to function immediately, and you have to make all these decisions, and you have to go pick out the casket. And, all this when you're really should be allowed to just sit there and integrate what's happened to you and cry and be taken care of. And in many cultures, people actually enact the grief. They'd have wailers or professional mourners who would cry both to placate the souls of the dead, but I think also that did was it sort of created a space for the mourners' emotions to be moved and transformed without them having to do all the work of it.
It kind of like opens the door for that. Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about the thing that you said earlier about wanting to be composted in the earth, and just all the work that you've done with permaculture and the earth activist training. And it's my sense, but I can't articulate why. And I'm hoping that you can, that ancestral reverence practices, ancestral practicing in a way with our ancestors and remembering these ways to be, are permacultural practices.
Well, I think one of the things that we learn from ecology or from gardening or from permaculture is, again, how important death and decay are to creating fertility. The soil only becomes fertile when you add stuff that's died and you let it decay. And to me, that's also a very core aspect of earth-based and goddess spirituality. That all the goddesses, all the gods are some aspect of this cycle of birth, growth, death, and regeneration, if you really think about it. So there's a lot of congruence there. To me, permaculture was always kind of like the practical aspect of believing the earth is sacred, the how-to part.
That's great. So, like, our death, our grief, it actually does play a role in the ecosystem at large.
I really believe it does.
And an important role, because it's like what fertility, and when I think about fertility, I don't just think about like procreation. I think about just kind of like the erotic impulse, the creative impulse, what that's the wellspring for it, right? Yeah. Starhawk, do you feel like you could riff at all on that piece of it, of like death and the erotic and connection to the earth?
Yeah, I think for me, one of the big appeals of earth-based spirituality, when I got involved in it when I was very young, 17 years old, my first year in college, and it was the 60s, and people were exploring all these different kinds of Eastern religions and yoga. It was new, right? All these, or it was new to us, wasn't new in the East, but yet they often seem to have this ascetic quality to them. And when I first met witches and they said, oh, in our religion, sexuality is sacred, I was like, yes, that's for me. And I think it does actually go with the idea of understanding death, because they're both about embracing physical bodily reality and all of its complexity. That we are born, that we are living sexual beings that have impulses and desires that go beyond our rational minds and that are stronger. The power of that desire when you're in the midst of it, and the intensity of that pleasure is just so overwhelming to all the ways we like to think that we're in control of everything and we're able to make rational decisions about everything. To me, that's part of the surrender to nature itself and the acknowledgement of the incredible power of the life force. And the life force that runs through us is also the death force, because death is always a part of life. Life and death are not separate, they are one process. And so I think when we embrace that, then we're able to also fully embrace the whole spectrum of sexuality, of the erotic, which goes beyond just sexual, stuff, but is the erotic response to color or to music or to nature, to a tree or to a flower. The whole world is full of sensual, erotic pleasure when you're open to it. But to be open to it also means you need to be open to the grief and the loss of what happens, because all of those things that thrill us so much with their life and with their beauty also fade and also die. So one of our key chants, is she changes everything she touches, and everything she touches changes, because change is the key. The world is alive and dynamic and constantly changing.
Thank you for that. What it calls to mind is that the healing is really in our deepening of our personal capacity, our personal and our collective capacity to be with all that is. Yeah. Great. Well, we're coming towards the end of our time together, and what I'd like to do is just make a little space for you to touch in with your mighty dead and your ancestors, and just see if there's any messages or anything that's really important to come through at this moment through this interview.
Yeah, a couple of things. One is, I think, for those of us who think of ourselves as activists, it's important to also learn about our own history and the history that comes from our own heritage of activism. And I'll say this to people who identify as, quote, white or European heritage, because I think often it's easy for us we start to get aware of the kind of privilege that comes with that heritage, and, the painful history of colonization and enslavement and genocide that goes with it. And it's easy for people to get just overwhelmed with grief and with guilt and that. But to go back and go, oh, there is this tremendous heritage of resistance. There were peasant rebellions in Europe, from the time of the Romans, with slave rebellions, like for 2,000 years, over and over and over again, of peasants rising up and saying, like, no, this system sucks. We're not going to take it. We are human. We want human rights. We deserve to have lives that are better than what you're offering to us. And the tragedy is that every single one of those ended badly for the peasants. A couple years ago, I was in Germany on the south near the Swiss border in an area where the peasant rebellion of 1525 took place, and was standing on the hill, and the woman, the herbalist Suzanne Fisher-Reese, who I was staying with, was like, oh yes, this is the hill where the peasants stood and watched as down below the army came in and slaughtered their wives and their children and burned, their farms. When we think about trauma, we carry that heritage of trauma, and yet we also have to acknowledge the incredible tenacity and resiliency that people had in resisting over and over and over again. Those rebellions were also part, I think, of what helped to trigger the witch persecutions, which I could say a lot about, but we don't really have the time to go into that right now. But I will say that Sylvia Federici's book, Caliban and the Witch, is a brilliant piece of work about the witch persecutions. I wrote about them also in Dreaming the Dark, and how they were the attempts by the power holders to maintain their power in the face of, again, the changes that were happening in Europe at the end of feudalism and the beginning of capitalism, and an immense trauma inflicted on women, but also on the peasant classes, that left us with this legacy of fear around anything that has to do with magic or this dynamic, alive worldview, with any kind of knowledge that's not approved of by the authorities, that helped to disrupt the unity of the peasant classes, and was an attempt to keep them from rebelling successfully. And I think for those of us who are drawn to witchcraft, we often have to kind of go through that fear and reconcile that unhealed trauma in order to actually find our power. The other thing I guess I would say is, when we look to the future, we are in a moment of incredible crisis in terms of our global future, with climate change and with the forces that are attempting to resist the deep level of changes that we need, with more and more brutality and more violence, and more and more authoritarian cruelty, especially directed at the same people who have over and over and over again been the victims of those power structures. So I think it's a time more than ever where we need to believe in the forces of regeneration and think of ourselves as agents of regeneration on every level. And that means resisting the destruction. And it also means finding the ways to heal, both personally, to heal the earth, to heal the land, to create communities built on healing and built on ways of living that bring us back into harmony. And I believe that's possible. I believe that's our work and our challenge and why we're here right now. And I also believe that if we pull it off, we'll have a much happier, more diverse, brighter, cleaner, and more beautiful world than we have today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to you and your people for that. And I just want to say that I was really inspired by reading City of Refuge last year because of the here's a vision, here's a model. A model doesn't exist. Okay, cool. Starhawk just made a model of what could be. And there's this thing in us that resonates with it. We're like, oh yeah, I know that already. Right. That was my experience. I was like, oh, I already know that somehow. My dissatisfaction with the way things are isn't based in just being a dissatisfied person. It's no, there's something in me that resonates of oh yeah, this is a way, this is an intact way to be together. Right. And, my own writing was oh, right, we need a model of what does erotic wellness look like in the world? It's kind of what City of Refuge did for me, and what is the vision of this, and what does this mean? And it really, I think what you're saying and what I'm hearing is that it comes down to power, and it comes down to reckoning with how do we each use our own power, and in a very how do we get so conscious of how we're using our power, how we're holding it in our body, when we're giving it away, when we're taking too much, how that relationship, that balance, that right-sizedness of the power balance inside, right, is and these resources that you're calling in of lean into the ancestors of resistance, lean into these ways that already, the rightness of being with power in good ways. Yeah.
Yeah. And supporting one another's power, and supporting one another's, it's I can support you in finding and expressing your erotic power and honoring it, and cherishing it, even if it looks really, really differently from the way I might find or express mine. As long as it's expressed in ways that are consensual with other people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I feel like we can build movements around that. We don't have to build movements on sort of bashing each other to be the same as we are, to be the way we think that people should be.
That's not democracy.
No. And it's also, to me, that's part of understanding the erotic and claiming it as sacred, is also understanding it's a mystery. And it's a mystery that often reveals itself very differently to people. Right? And that's okay. I don't have to define the mystery for somebody else.
I think I want a t-shirt that says that.
Right, yeah.
It's very freeing. Phew, I don't have to do that. Okay. You define your own mystery. Yeah.
But at this moment in time, I think we do have to defend one another's right to define that mystery for ourselves, because there are forces out there that are really interested in forcing it into particular molds and not allowing much deviation from that.
And those forces, those anti-sex forces, are the anti-life forces, are the anti-liberation forces, are the they're the same forces. We're not talking about different forces. They're all the thing. There's life affirming and there's life denying, right?
Right,
and
which is often ironic, because they will call themselves pro-life, but right.
Yeah. Oh, Starhawk. Beautiful. Thank you. Thank you so much for the gift of your time and for all the gift of your work and all the songs and all the rituals and all the prayers and all of the actions. And I know that there, thousands and thousands of us are in gratitude to you and for the gift of your life.
Well, thank you. And thank you for doing this work and helping to spread the word, for all that you do.
Thanks, folks, for listening to this episode. And would love to hear from you. Would love to hear how this episode lands for you, what you're thinking about as you're listening to this conversation. You can go to bespokenbones.com and contact me through there. You can go to Starhawk's website, starhawk.org, and there's all kinds of, she's everywhere. She's always teaching. There's all kinds of stuff to get involved with if you feel drawn to her work and this great work. So thanks for listening. I'm Pavini Moray. This is Bespoken Bones, and we'll be back every new and full moon with more embodied goodness and ancestral wisdom.
Yay. Thanks.